Hell Screen by Ryunosuke Akutagawa. Part 1. I'm certain there has never been anyone like our great lord of Horikawa. In a dream, before his lordship was born, a maternal ladyship saw the awesomely armed guardian deity of the West, or so people say. In any case, his lordship seems to have innate qualities that distinguished him from ordinary human beings, and because of this, his accomplishments never ceased to amaze us. You need only glance at his mansion in the capital's Horikawa district to sense the boldness of its conception. Some have questioned the wisdom of his lordship's undertaking such a project, comparing him to China's first emperor, whose subjects were forced to build the Great Wall. But such critics might be likened to the proverbial blind men who described the elephant according only to the parts they could feel. It was never his lordship's intention to seek splendor and glory for himself alone. He was always a man of great magnanimity, who shared his joys with the wider world. Surely, this is why, when rumor had it that the ghost of Toru, minister of the left, was appearing night after night at the site of his ruined mansion at Higashi Sanjo, it took only a simple rebuke from his lordship to make the spirit vanish. No wonder. All residents of the capital revered him as a reincarnation of the Buddha. One time, it is said, when construction of the Nagara Bridge seems to be running counter to the will of the local deity, his lordship offered up a favorite boy attendant as a human sacrifice to be buried at the foot of a pillar. Oh, there's no end to the tales. For sheer horror, though, none of them measures up to the story of the screen, depicting scenes of hell, which is now a prized family heirloom. I myself had served as one of his lordship's men for a full 20 years, but what I witnessed then was more terrible than anything I had ever, or have ever, experienced. In order to tell you the story of the hell screen, however, I must first tell you about the painter who created it. His name was Yoshihide. Yoshihide was famous back then as the greatest painter in the land, but he looked like nothing more than a thoroughly unpleasant old man, all skin and bones. You could see he had a mean streak, and his lips, unnaturally red for such an old man, gave a disturbing bestial impression. Some people said the redness came from his moistening his paintbrush with his lips, but I wonder about that. Crueler tongues used to say that he looked and moved like a monkey, and they went so far as to give him the nickname Monkeyhide. That nickname reminds me of an episode. Yoshihide had a daughter, his only child. A lovely girl, utterly unlike her father. She had been taken into the Horikawa mansion as a junior lady-in-waiting for the young mistress. Around that time, his lordship was presented with a tame monkey, and the young master, who was then at the height of his boyish naughtiness, decided to name it Yoshihide. This gave everyone in the household a hearty laugh. Oh, if only they had been satisfied just to laugh. But whatever the monkey did, people would find a reason to torment it, and always with a shout of Yoshihide! Now one day, as Yoshihide's daughter was gliding down an outdoor corridor to deliver a note, the monkey Yoshihide darted in through the sliding door at the far end, in full flight from something. Then, who should appear chasing after it but the young master, brandishing a switch and shouting, "Come back here, you tangerine thief!" Yoshihide's daughter drew up short at the sight, and the monkey clung to her skirts with a pitiful cry. This must have aroused her compassion, for giving a little bow, she said with cool clarity, "Forgive me for interfering, my young lord, but he is just an animal. Please pardon him." Temper still up from the chase, the young master scowled. "Why are you protecting him? He stole my tangerine!" "He is just an animal," she repeated. "He doesn't know any better." And then, smiling sadly, she added, "His name is Yoshihide after all. I can't just stand by and watch my father being punished." This was apparently enough to break the young master's will. "All right then. If you're pleading for your father's life, I'll let him off this time." After this incident, Yoshihide's daughter and the little monkey grew close. The girl had a golden bell that her young mistress had given her, which she hung from the monkey's neck, and he, for his part, would almost never leave her sight. Then, strangely enough, people stopped teasing the monkey. His lordship himself ordered the girl to appear before him, with the monkey in her arms. "I admire your filial behavior," he said. "Here, take this." And he presented her with a fine scarlet underrobe. And so his lordship's partiality for the girl was born entirely from his wish to commend her filial devotion to her father, and not, as rumor had it, from any physical attraction he might have felt for her. Not that such suspicions were entirely groundless, but there will be time for me to tell you about that later. For now, let me continue with my story of her father, Yoshihide. As I have said, the monkey Yoshihide quickly became everyone's little darling, but Yoshihide himself remained an object of universal scorn, and not only in the Hirokawa mansion. Even such a eminent Buddhist prelate as the abbot of Yokawa hated him. Some said this was because he had drawn a caricature ridiculing certain aspect of the abbot's behavior, but this was merely a rumor that circulated among the lower classes, and as such can hardly be credited. In any case, Yoshihide's reputation was so bad that anyone you asked would have told you the same thing. His appearance was not the only thing that people hated. He was a terrible miser. He was harsh in his dealings with people. He had no shame. He was lazy and greedy. But worst of all, he was insolent and arrogant. He never let you forget that he was the greatest painter in the land. No wonder, then, that such a man would commit acts of sacrilege in his work. In painting the goddess Kishoten, he used the face of a common harlot, and to portray the mighty flame-draped Fudo, his model was a criminal. If you tried to warn him that he was flirting with danger, he would respond with feigned innocence. "I am the one who painted them after all," he would say. "Are you trying to tell me that my own Buddhas and gods are going to punish me?" The man's arrogance simply knew no bounds. It goes without saying that Yoshihide lorded it over the other painters of his time. True, his brushwork and colors were utterly different from theirs, and so the many painters with whom he was on bad terms tended to speak of him as a charlatan. All they had to say about his work was how eerie and unsettling they found it. Take his 5 levels of rebirth on the Ryugaiji Temple gate, for example. "When I passed the gate late at night," one said, "I could hear the dying celestials sighing and sobbing." "That's nothing," another claimed. "How about the portraits of the household's ladies-in-waiting that his lordship ordered from Yoshihide? Every single woman he painted fell ill and died within 3 years. It was as if he had snatched their very souls from them." But Yoshihide was so perverse, as I've said, that remarks like this only filled him with pride. Yet even he, in all his incredible perversity, displayed human tenderness when it came to one thing. By this I mean his only daughter. His love for her was no less strong than hers for him. I gather that he provided for her every need without the slightest objection. Yoshihide's love for his daughter, however, remained just that, love. It never occurred to him that he should be trying to find her a good husband. Far from it. He was not above hiring street thugs to beat up anyone who might make improper advances to her. So even when his lordship honored her with a position of junior lady-in-waiting in his own household, Yoshihide was far from happy, and for a while he always wore a sour expression whenever he was in his lordship's presence. I have no doubt that people who witnessed this display were the ones who began speculating that his lordship had been attracted to the girl's beauty when he ordered her into service despite her father's objections. Such rumors were entirely false, of course. It was nothing but Yoshihide's obsessive love for his daughter that kept him wishing to have her step down from service. I remember the time his lordship ordered him to do a painting of Monju as a child, and Yoshihide pleased him greatly with the marvelous work. "You can have anything you want as your reward," said his lordship. "Anything at all." And can you imagine what he asked? "If it please your lordship, I beg you to return my daughter to her former lowly state." Where in the world does one find such audacity? Not even a man as grandly magnanimous as his lordship could help feeling some small annoyance at such a request. "That will not happen," he said, all but spitting out the words, and he abruptly withdrew. This was not the first nor the last such incident, and with each repetition, it seems to me, his lordship gazed on Yoshihide with increasing coldness. The girl, for her part, seemed to fear for her father's welfare. Often she could be seen sobbing quietly to herself in her room. All this only reinforced the rumor that his lordship was enamored of the girl. People also said the command to paint the screen had something to do with her rejection of his lordship's advances. As I see it, it was entirely out of pity for the girl's situation that his lordship refused to let her go. I'm certain he believed that she would be far better off if he were to keep her in his mansion than if he sent her back to her hard-headed old father. At any rate, one day, for whatever reason, his lordship summoned Yoshihide and ordered him to paint a folding screen portraying the 8 Buddhist hells. Oh, that screen! I can almost see its terrifying images before me now. The 10 kings of hell and their minions were over in one small corner, and everything else, the entire screen, was enveloped in a terrible firestorm. The sinners writhing in the hellfire of Yoshihide's powerful brush had nothing in common with those to be seen in ordinary pictures of hell. For Yoshihide had included sinners from all stations in life, from the most brilliant luminary of His Majesty's exalted circle to the basest beggar and outcast. But there they were, human beings of every kind, inundated by smoke and flame, tormented by wardens of hell with their heads of bulls and horses. And the kinds of torture were as numberless as the sinners themselves, flogging with an iron scourge, crushing under a gigantic rock, pecking by a monstrous bird, grinding in the jaws of a poisonous serpent. But surely the single most horrifying image of all was that of a carriage plummeting through space. As it fell, it grazed the upper boughs of a sword tree, where clumps of corpses were skewered on fang-like branches. Blast of hell wind swept up the carriage curtains to reveal a court lady, her straight black hip-length hair flying upward in the flames, the full whiteness of her throat laid bare as she writhed in agony. The sheer horror of the entire screen seemed to be concentrated in this one figure. Oh yes, this was it. For the sake of painting this one image, the terrible event occurred. Otherwise, how could even the great Yoshihide have painted hell's torments so vividly? In a sense, the hell in his painting was the hell into which Yoshihide himself, the greatest painter in the realm, was doomed one day to fall. I'm afraid that, in my haste to speak of the screen, I may have reversed the order of my story. Now, let me continue with the part about Yoshihide, when he received his lordship's command to do the painting. For nearly 6 months after the commission, Yoshihide poured all his energy into the screen, never once calling at his lordship's residence. Don't you find it strange that such a doting father should abandon all thought of seeing his daughter once he had started on a painting? According to one of his apprentices, Yoshihide always approached his work like a man possessed by a fox spirit. In fact, people used to say that the only reason Yoshihide was able to make such a name for himself was that he had pledged his soul to one of the great gods of fortune. What this means, I suspect, is that once he picked up his brush, Yoshihide thought of nothing else but completing the painting before him. This is not merely to say that he would keep the latticed shutters pulled down and spend all day mixing secret combinations of paint, or posing his apprentices in various costumes for him to sketch. No, that was normal behavior for the working Yoshihide. Remember, this was the man who, when he was painting his 5 levels of rebirth, went out specially to inspect a corpse lying on the roadside. He spent hours sitting before it, sketching its rotting face and limbs without missing a hair. I don't blame you then, if you're among those who cannot imagine what I mean when I say that his concentration during his work on the hell screen was especially intense. I haven't time now to explain this in detail, but I can at least tell you the most important things. One day, an apprentice of Yoshihide's was busy dissolving pigments when the master suddenly said to him, "I'm planning to take a nap, but I don't know. I've been having bad dreams lately." There was nothing strange about this, so the apprentice merely answered, "I see, sir," and continued with his work. Yoshihide, however, was not his usual self. Somewhat hesitantly, he made a surprising request. "I want you to sit and work beside me while I sleep." The apprentice thought it rather odd that his master should be worrying about dreams, but it was a simple enough request, and he promptly agreed to it. "All right then," Yoshihide said, still looking worried. "Come inside right away." Inside meant the room where the master actually did his painting. In the dull glow of an oil lamp stood the large folding screen, its panels arranged in a semicircle and still only sketched out in charcoal. Yoshihide lay down with his head pillowed on his forearm and slipped into the deep sleep of an utterly exhausted man. Hardly any time had gone by, however, when the apprentice began to hear a sound that he had no way of describing. It was a voice, he told me, but a strange and eerie one. Soon, in snatches, the voice began to form words that came to him as if from underwater, like the muffled cries of a drowning man. What? The voice said. You want me to come with you? Where? Why are you taking me? To hell, you say? Who are you? Who can't be... The apprentice peered fearfully at his master's face. Not only had the furrowed skin gone stark white, but the dry-lipped mouth strained wide open as if gasping for breath. The youth saw something moving in his master's mouth with dizzying speed, like an object being yanked by a cord. But then, imagine, he realized the thing was Yoshihide's tongue. Who could it be but you? You! Damn you! It is you! I thought so. What's that? You want me to follow you? To hell! My daughter is waiting for me in hell! The apprentice told me that an uncanny feeling overcame him at that point. His eyes seemed to make out vague, misshapen shadows that slid over the surface of the screen. Naturally, he immediately reached over and shook Yoshihide as hard as he could. But rather than waking, the master, in a dreamlike state, went on talking to himself. Desperate now, the apprentice grabbed the jar for washing brushes and splashed the water into Yoshihide's face. I'm waiting for you, Yoshihide was saying. So hurry and get into the cart. Come along to hell. But the moment the water hit him, his words turned to a strangled moan. At last, he opened his eyes, and he sprang up more wildly than if he had been jabbed with a needle. But the misshapen creatures must have been with him still, for he stared into space with mouth agape and with terrified eyes. At length, he returned to himself and, without a hint of gratitude, barked at the poor apprentice. I'm all right now. Get out of here. The apprentice knew he would be scolded if he resisted his master at a time like this, so he hurried out from the room. I imagine that what little you have heard is enough for you to grasp the fanatic intensity with which Yoshihide approached his work. Let me give you one last terrible example concerning a young apprentice, no more than 13 or 14, who could have lost his life for the hell screen. It happened one night, when the boy was called into the master's studio. There he found Yoshihide by the tripod lamp balancing a piece of raw meat on his palm and feeding it to a bird, the likes of which he had never seen before. The bird was the size of a cat, and in fact, with its 2 feather tufts sticking out from its head like ears, and its big round amber-colored eyes, it did look very much like a cat. Well then, the young apprentice, assuming for himself that the strange bird on the table was a model Yoshihide needed for the hell screen, knelt before the painter and asked in all humility, "How can I help you, master?" Almost as if he had not heard the boy speak, Yoshihide licked his red lips and jerked his chin toward the bird. Not bad, eh? Look how tame it is. Please tell me, master, what is it? I have never seen anything like it before. What? Never seen anything like it? Yoshihide responded with his familiar scornful laugh. That's what you get for growing up in the capital. It's a horned owl. A hunter brought it to me a few days ago from Mount Kurama. Only we don't usually find them so tame. As he spoke, Yoshihide slowly raised his hand and gave a soft upward stroke to the feathers of the owl's back, just as the bird finished swallowing the chunk of meat. Instantly, the bird emitted a shriek and leapt from the tabletop, aiming its outstretched talons at the apprentice's face. Had the boy not shot his arm out to protect himself, I have no doubt that he would have ended up with more than a gash or 2 on his face. He cried out and shook his sleeve in an attempt to sweep the bird away. Beak clattering, the owl lunged at him again. Disregarding Yoshihide's presence, the apprentice ran around the cramped room. The monster, of course, stuck with him, using any opening to go straight for his eyes. With each lunge came a tremendous flapping of wings that filled the boy with dread. Being attacked by the owl, however, was not what most frightened the boy. What really made his flesh crawl was the way the master followed the commotion with his cold stare, taking his time to spread out a piece of paper, lick his brush, and then set about capturing a terrible image of a delicate boy being tormented by a hideous bird. At the sight, the apprentice was overcome by an inexpressible terror. For a time, he says, he even thought his master might kill him. And you actually couldn't say that such a thing was out of the question, for it did seem that Yoshihide's sole purpose in calling the apprentice to his studio that night had been to set the owl on him and draw him trying to escape. Thus, when the apprentice caught that glimpse of his master at work, he heard a scream escape his throat as he slumped down against the sliding door in the corner of the room. In that same instant, Yoshihide himself cried out and jumped to his feet, whereupon the beating of the owl's wings grew faster and louder, and there came the clatter of something falling over and a tearing sound. Having covered his head in terror, the apprentice now raised it again to find that the room had gone pitch dark, and he heard Yoshihide's angry voice calling to the other apprentices. Eventually, there was a far-off cry in response, and soon an apprentice rushed in with a lantern held high. In its glow, the boy saw the tripod collapsed on the floor, and the mats and planking soaked in the oil of the overturned lamp. He saw the owl, too, beating one wing in apparent pain as it flopped around the room. On the far side of the table, looking stunned, Yoshihide was raising himself from the floor and muttering something incomprehensible. And no wonder. A black snake was tightly coiled around the owl from neck to tail and over one wing. The apprentice had probably knocked a jar over as he slumped to the floor, and when the snake crawled out, the owl must have made the mistake of trying to grab it in his talons. The two apprentices gaped at the bizarre scene and at each other, until with a silent bow to the master, they slipped out of the room. And let me tell you, this was by no means Yoshihide at his worst. Hell's Screen by Ryunosuke Akutagawa, Part 2. I forgot to mention that it was the beginning of autumn, when his lordship commanded Yoshihide, the greatest painter in the land, to paint the Hell Screen. From then, until the end of winter, the apprentices were continually subjected to their master's frightening behavior. At that point, however, something seemed to interfere with Yoshihide's work on the screen. Indeed, he occasionally seemed to be on the verge of painting over those parts that he had already completed. No one knew what he was finding so difficult, and what's more, no one tried to find out. His apprentices felt as if they were locked in a cage with a tiger or wolf, and they found ways to keep their distance from their master. For that reason, I have little to tell you about that period. The only unusual thing I can think of is that the hard-headed old devil suddenly turned weepy. An apprentice told me that one day he walked into the garden and saw the master standing on the veranda, gazing blankly at the sky with its promise of spring, his eyes full of tears. Don't you find it odd that this arrogant man, who went so far as to sketch a corpse on the roadside for his 5 levels of rebirth, would cry like an infant just because the painting of the screen wasn't going well. In any case, while Yoshihide was madly absorbed in his work, his daughter began to show increasing signs of melancholy, until the rest of us could see that she was often fighting back her tears. This gave rise to all sorts of speculation that she was worried about her father, or that she was suffering the pangs of love. But soon people were saying that it was all because his lordship was trying to bend her to his will. Then the gossiping ground to a halt, as though everyone had suddenly forgotten about her. A certain event occurred at the time. Well after the first watch of the night, I was walking down an outdoor corridor when the monkey called Yoshihide came flying at me from out of nowhere and started tugging at my trouser skirts. As I recall it, this was one of those warm early spring nights when you expect at any time now to be catching the romantic fragrance of plum blossoms in the pale moonlight. But what did I see in the moon's faint glow? It was the monkey bearing its white fangs, wrinkling up its nose, and shrieking. An eerie chill was only 3 parts of what I felt. The other 7 parts were anger at having my new trousers yanked out like that, and I considered kicking the beast aside and continuing on my way. I quickly changed my mind, however. The way the monkey was behaving, there was obviously something wrong. I therefore gave up trying to resist and allowed myself to be pulled several paces farther. Where the corridor turned a corner, the pale surface of his lordship's pond could be seen stretching off through the darkness. When the animal led me to that point, my ears were assaulted by the frantic yet strangely muffled sounds of what I took to be a struggle in a nearby room. If this was an intruder, I resolved, I would teach him a lesson, and holding my breath, I edged closer to the sliding door. My approach, however, was obviously too slow, for the monkey Yoshihide scampered around me in circles, once, twice, 3 times, then bounded up to my shoulder with a strangled cry. Instinctively, I jerked my head aside to avoid being scratched. This sent me staggering, and I stumbled backward, slamming against the door. Now, I could no longer hesitate. I shot the door open and crouched, ready to spring. At that very moment, something rose up to block my view. With a start, I realized it was a woman. She flew toward me as if someone had flung her out of the room. She nearly hit me, but instead she tumbled forward and, why, I could not tell, went down on one knee, staring up at me, as if at some terrifying sight. I'm sure I need not tell you it was Yoshihide's daughter. That night, however, my eyes beheld her as though she were an utterly different person. Her eyes were huge and shining, and her cheeks seemed to be burning red. Her disheveled clothes gave her an erotic allure that contrasted sharply with her usual childish innocence. Could this actually be the daughter of Yoshihide? I stared at this beautiful girl in the moonlight, and then I flicked my eyes toward the hurried footsteps receding into the distance and asked, "Who was that?" She refused to answer and would only shake her head. She bit her lip as tears gathered on her long lashes. Born stupid, I can never understand anything that isn't perfectly obvious, and so I had no idea what to say to her. I could do nothing but stand there, feeling as if my only purpose was to listen to the wild beating of her heart. How long this went on, I don't know. But eventually, I gently told the girl, "Go to your room now." Her agitation seemed to have subsided somewhat. Assailed by an uneasy feeling that I had seen something I was not meant to see, and a sense of shame toward anyone, and no one in particular, I began to pad my way back up to the corridor. I had hardly walked 10 paces, however, when again I felt a tug, a timid one, at the skirt of my trousers. I whirled around, startled, but what do you think it was? I looked down to find the monkey Yoshihide prostrating himself at my feet, bowing over and over in thanks, his golden bell ringing. Perhaps 2 weeks went by after that. All of a sudden, Yoshihide arrived at the mansion to beg a personal audience with his lordship. His lordship rarely allowed anyone to come into his presence, but that day, as so often before, he assented readily to Yoshihide's request and had him shown in without a moment's delay. The man went down on all fours before his lordship, and at length he began to speak in husky tones. "I come into your honored presence this day, my lord, regarding the screen bearing images of hell which his lordship ordered me to paint. I have applied myself to it day and night, outdone myself, such that my efforts have begun to bear fruit, and it is largely finished." "This is excellent news. I'm very pleased." Even as his lordship spoke these words, however, his voice seemed oddly lacking in power and vitality. "No, my lord. I'm afraid the news is anything but excellent," said Yoshihide, his eyes still fastened on the floor in a way that hinted at anger. "There is a part that I'm unable to paint." "What? Unable to paint?" "Indeed, sir. As a rule, I can only paint what I've seen, or even if I succeed in painting something unknown to me, I myself cannot be satisfied with it. This is the same as not being able to paint it." As his lordship listened to Yoshihide's words, his face gradually took on a mocking smile. "Which would mean that if you wanted to paint a screen depicting hell, you would have to have seen hell itself?" "Exactly, my lord. In the great fire some years ago, though, I saw flames with my own eyes that I could use for those of the hell of searing heat." "What about sinners, though? And hell wardens? You have never seen those, have you?" "I have seen a person bound in chains," said Yoshihide, "and I have done a detailed sketch of someone being tormented by a monstrous bird. No, I think it cannot be said that I have never seen sinners being tortured." "And as for hell wardens," said Yoshihide, breaking into an eerie smile, "my eyes have beheld them any number of times as I drift between sleeping and waking. No, they are not the ones I'm having so much difficulty painting." I suspect this shocked even his lordship. For a long while he only glared at Yoshihide until, with an angry twitch of the brow, he spat out, "All right then. What is it that you say you are unable to paint?" "In the center of the screen, falling from the sky, I want to paint an aristocrat's carriage." As he spoke, Yoshihide raised himself to look directly at his lordship for the first time. I had heard that Yoshihide could be like a madman where painting was concerned. To me, the look in his eyes at that moment was terrifying in that very way. In the carriage, a voluptuous noble woman writhes in agony, her long black hair tossing in the ferocious flames as she choked on the rising clouds of smoke. Around her swarm fierce, carnivorous birds, snatching their beaks in anticipation. Oh, my lord, it is this image of the noble woman in the carriage that I'm unable to paint." "And therefore?" His lordship seemed to be deriving an odd sort of pleasure from this, as he urged Yoshihide to continue. Yoshihide, red lips trembling as with a fever, cried, "I beg you, my lord, have your men set a carriage on fire. Let me watch the flames devour its frame, and if possible..." A dark cloud crossed his lordship's face, but no sooner had it passed than he broke into a loud cackle. He was still choking with laughter when he spoke. "Possible? I'll do whatever you want. Don't waste time worrying about what is possible." His lordship's words filled me with a terrible foreboding. And in fact, his appearance at that moment was anything but ordinary. White foam gathered at the corners of his mouth. It was as if he himself had become infused with Yoshihide's madness. And no sooner had he finished speaking than laughter, endless laughter, exploded from his throat. "I'll burn a carriage for you," he said, "and I'll have a voluptuous woman inside it, dressed in a noble woman's robes. She will die writhing with agony in flames. I have to salute you, Yoshihide. Who could have thought of such a thing but the greatest painter in the land?" Yoshihide went pale when he heard this, and for a time the only part of him that moved was his lips. He seemed to be gasping for breath. "1,000 thanks to you, my lord." His voice barely audible. Perhaps the full horror of his own plan had come all too clear to him as he heard it spelled out in his lordship's words. Only this one time in my life did I ever think of Yoshihide as a man to be pitied. 2 or 3 nights later, his lordship summoned Yoshihide as promised to witness the burning of the carriage. He held the event at his late younger sister's mountain retreat. As it happened, the carriage burning took place on one of those pitch-dark, moonless nights. Oil lamps revealed his lordship seated in cross-legged ease on the veranda. Beneath a turquoise robe, he wore deep lavender-patterned trousers. On a thick ground mat edged in white brocade, his position was of course elevated above the half-dozen or so attendants who surrounded him. These men presented a strangely terrifying, almost dreamlike spectacle. The lamplight flickering in the night wind turned them all dark one moment, bright the next. And then there was the carriage itself. It stood out against the night, its tall cabin woven of the finest split palm leaf, exactly as Yoshihide had requested. When I saw its gold fitting, glimmering like stars in the sky, and considered what was soon to happen, a shiver went through me in spite of the warm night. As for what might be inside the carriage, there was no way to tell. Its blinds had been rolled down tight. Yoshihide himself was situated at some remove, kneeling on the ground directly opposite the veranda. He looked especially small and shabby, as though the star-filled sky were a weight pressing down upon him. Midnight was approaching. I felt as if the darkness enveloping the garden were silently watching us, all breathing, the only sound an occasional rush of night wind, each gust wafting towards us the resinous smell from the pine smoke of the torches. His lordship remained silent for some moments, observing the mysterious scene, but then, edging forward where he sat, he cried sharply, "Yoshihide!" Yoshihide may have said some word in response, but to my ears it sounded like nothing so much as a moan. "Tonight, Yoshihide, I'm going to burn a carriage for you, as you requested." When he said this, his lordship glanced at the men around him. I thought I saw a meaningful smile pass between him and certain of them. Of course, It could have been my imagination.
I want you to look at this, his lordship said. This is my carriage. You know it well, I'm sure. I will now have it set afire, in order that you may see the hell of searing heat here on earth, before your eyes.
His lordship reverted to silence, and his eyes flashed another signal to his men. Then, with sudden vehemence, he cried,
Chained inside the carriage is a sinful woman. When we set the carriage afire, her flesh will be roasted, her bones will be charred. She will die an agonizing death. Never again will we have such a perfect model for the screen. Do not fail to watch as her snow-white flesh erupts in flames.
His lordship sunk into silence for yet a third time, but whatever could have been in his mind? Now, all he did was laugh soundlessly, his shoulders quaking.
All right, man. Raise the blind! Let Yoshihide see the woman in sight.
On hearing this command, one of the conscripts, torch held high, strode to the carriage and whipped up the blind. The torch crackled and flickered, and cast its red gleam inside. On the carriage's matted floor, cruelly chained, sat a woman. And oh, who could have failed to recognize her? Her long black hair flowed in a voluptuous band across a gorgeous robe embroidered in cherry blossoms. For all the differences in costuming, there was no mistaking that graceful neck where now a gag was fastened, that touchingly modest profile. They belonged to none other than Yoshihide's daughter. I could hardly keep from crying out. Just then, the samurai kneeling across from me sprang to his feet and, pressing threateningly on his sword hilt, glared at Yoshihide. Startled by this sudden movement, I turned my gaze towards the painter. He looked as if this spectacle were driving him half mad. Where he had been crouching until then, he was on his feet now, and poised to run towards the carriage. Unfortunately, he was in the shadow far away from me, and so I did not have a clear view of his face. My frustration lasted but a moment, however. Now, drained of color though it was, Yoshihide's face appeared before me with such clarity it seemed to have cut its way through the surrounding darkness. For suddenly, his lordship had cried,
Burn it!
The conscripts flung their torches, and the carriage with Yoshihide's daughter inside burst into flame. The fire engulfed the entire carriage. Clouds of smoke swirled aloft, stark white against the blackness of the night, and finally a shower of sparks spurted upward with such force that in a single instant the blinds, the side panels, and the roof's metal fittings were ripped off in the blast and sent flying. As close as I had come to crying out before, now I could only gape in mute awe at the horrifying spectacle. But what of the girl's father? I will never forget the look on Yoshihide's face at that moment. He had started toward the carriage on impulse, but halted when the flames flared up. He then stood there with arms outstretched, eyes devouring the smoke and flames. His wide, staring eyes, his contorted lips, all drew a vivid picture of the shock, the terror, and the sorrow that traversed Yoshihide's heart by turns. Such anguish, I suspect, would not be seen even on the guiltiest sinner about to face the judgment of the 10 kings of hell. But what of his lordship himself? Smiling strangely now and then, he stared straight ahead, never taking his eyes off the carriage. And the girl in the carriage. I don't think I have the courage to describe in detail what she looked like then. The pale whiteness of her upturned face as she choked on the smoke, the tangled length of her hair as she tried to shake the flames from it, It was all so cruel, so terrible, especially at one point when the night wind rushed down from the mountain to sweep away the smoke. The sight of her against the flaming background, gnawing at her gag, writhing as if to snap the chains that bound her. Just then, some black thing shot from the palace roof into the blazing carriage. It travelled in a perfect straight line like a ball that has been kicked. And as the carriage's burning side lattices collapsed inward, glowing as if coated in a crimson lacquer, the thing grasped the girl's straining shoulders and hurled a long, piercing, and inexpressibly anguished scream out beyond the billowing smoke. For though it had been left tethered back at the Horikawa mansion, what we saw now clinging to the girl's shoulders against a flaming backdrop was the monkey Yoshihide. We could see the monkey for only the briefest moment, though. A fountain of sparks shot up to the sky like gold dust in black lacquer, and then not only the monkey, but the girl too, was shrouded in black smoke. But oh, how strange it was to see the painter now, standing absolutely rigid before the pillar of fire. Yoshihide, who only a few moments earlier had seemed to be suffering the torments of hell, stood there, his whole wrinkled face suffused now with an inexpressible radiance. I could have sworn that the man's eyes were no longer watching his daughter dying in agony, that instead the gorgeous colors of flames and the sight of a woman suffering in them were giving him joy beyond measure. The most wondrous thing was not that he watched his only daughter's death throes with apparent joy, but rather that Yoshihide at that moment possessed a strange, inhuman majesty that resembled the rage of the king of beasts himself, as you might see him in a dream. For this reason, although I might have been imagining it, the countless night birds that flew around us squawking in alarm at each new eruption of flames seemed to keep their distance from Yoshihide. Trembling inwardly, scarcely breathing, and filled with a bizarre sense of adoration, we kept our eyes fastened on Yoshihide as if we were present at the decisive moment when a lump of stone or wood becomes a holy image of the Buddha. But among us, only one, his lordship, looked on as if transformed into another person. His noble countenance drained of color, the corners of his mouth flecked with foam, hands clutching his knees as he panted like a beast in need of water. Word soon spread that his lordship had burned the carriage that night, and there seemed to have been many who were highly critical of the event. First came the question of Yoshihide's daughter. Why had his lordship chosen to burn her alive? The rumor most often heard was that he had done it out of spite for her rejection of his love. I'm certain, however, that he did it to punish the twisted personality of an artist who would go so far as to burn a carriage and kill a human being to complete the painting of a screen. And then, Yoshihide was also the topic of much negative commentary. How, after seeing his own daughter burnt alive, could he want to finish the screen painting? Some cursed him as a beast in human guise. One who allied himself with this opinion was His Reverence the Abbot of Yokawa, who always used to say,
"Excel in his art though he might, if a man does not know the 5 virtues, he can only end up in hell."
A month went by, and the screen was finished at last. Yoshihide brought it to the mansion, and humbly presented it for his lordship's inspection. His Reverence happened to be visiting at the time. Until he actually saw the screen, he was glowering at Yoshihide, but then he slapped his knee and exclaimed,
What magnificent work!
I can still see the bitter smile on his lordship's face when he heard those words. Almost no one spoke ill of Yoshihide after that. Could it be because all who saw the screen, even those who had always hated him, were struck by strangely solemn feelings when they witnessed the tortures of the hell of searing heat in all their reality? By then, however, Yoshihide numbered among those who are no longer of this world. The night after he finished the screen, he tied a rope to a beam in his room and hanged himself. I suspect that, having sent his daughter on ahead to the other world, he could not bear to go on living here as if nothing had happened. His body lies buried in the ruins of his home. The little stone marker is probably so cloaked in moss now, after decades of exposure to the wind and rain, that no one can tell whose grave it is anymore.